Good morning, everyone. My name is Devaki, and this is Chandrika, and we'll be doing service for you this morning. And this morning's reading is from Rays of the One Light, Bible commentaries, and the Bhagavad Gita commentaries by Swami Kriyananda. And this morning is Abiding in God. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Yogananda often emphasized, more often to his disciples than to the general public, but also to everyone generally, for it was a universal teaching, the importance of attunement. For divine understanding cannot be created, it must be perceived. To the disciples, Yogananda spoke of the importance of attunement with the Guru. To others, he urged the importance of at least of attuning oneself to higher consciousness. Can an eagle rise without support from the sustaining air? Jesus Christ said in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 15, I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit, for without me ye can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather him and cast him into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father's glorified, herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples. How can we abide in him, Jesus says, if my words abide in you? By words he meant not only his spoken words, but his vibrations, his consciousness, of which the words are only an expression. We must abide by the teachings, but we must also absorb those teachings into ourselves, that they become our own experience. For disciples of this path, the more in their hearts they live consciously in the presence of the masters, the more they will find the divine presence living within them. And for all truth seekers, whether disciples or not, the more they live sustained inwardly by the awareness of God's presence, the higher they will find themselves soaring in wisdom and in joy. For the Bhagavad Gita says in the 10th chapter, I am the source of everything. From me all creation emerges. Blessed with this realization, the wise, awe-stricken, adore me. And thus through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
And from Whispers from Eternity, Prayer Demands by Paramahansa Yogananda. The prayer demand, flood me with thy omnipresent love. O fountain of love, flood the lowlands of our love for home and family with thy omnipresent love. O mighty source of all our rivers of desire, teach us not to cut ourselves off from thee, hunting on dry sands of self-satisfaction. Love is our soul's birthright. We demand now that all the rivers of our cravings be redirected through valleys of humility, eager self-sacrifice, and concern for others, until reinforced by thy torrential blessings, they merge in the ocean of all fulfillment in thee. Bless us that the rivulets of our sympathy, affection, and love lose not themselves in the sands of dreary selfishness. Let the little, lonely, separately moving streamlets of our love, which come from Thee, merge at last in the vastness of Thy perfect love. And as Devaki read so beautifully for us from the rays of the one light, the topic today is abiding in God. And its general focus is on the concept of attunement and of learning how to allow God's word to abide in us, to explore what that means ever more deeply. And when I read the passage about my words abide in you, I immediately thought of the story of a particular saint. And I want to read a passage from another saint who was a visionary and lived at a time where there was strife in the world, strife and conflict, lots of sadness and grief and loss. And she spoke of the coming of this particular saint. And I don't want to paraphrase it because I want to give you the essence exactly as she has put it down through the time. Saint Hildegard of Bingen was highly respected, but her visions made her the mouthpiece of dreadful accusations. She saw the triumphs of Christianity as bloody comets of war, which spread seeds of disaster and left the earth in darkness. She saw that the struggle of the church for world dominion was treachery against the Lord and the downfall of mankind. For the future, through the dark night of ruin, a star blazed to comfort and encourage the scattered Christians. The Spirit of God will descend among men. He will not be possessed of beauty and force, which the world can admire, but he will be poor and destitute like a withered reed. And love and humility will gird his loins. His hut will be a house of prayer for all nations. Now this blaze of Spirit of God descending to earth eventually became manifested in the form of Saint Francis of Assisi. And Saint Francis, there's many stories to tell of his love, his humility, and how he, through his attunement to Jesus, was able to transform the world. And some of you who know his story or know that I'm going to be jumping back and forth in chronological time. But the reason for that is to bring forth certain particular stories that share important messages about this topic. And so at one point, and this was after he had taken his inner vows of poverty, and he was wandering from town to town, sharing the teachings, the joy of the gospel, sharing and being serviceable to others, offering support to the world as best he could. As he was walking from one town to another, he encountered a woman with several children. And she had no food to feed her children, and she was destitute and she was desperate. And she approached him and said, "Please, sir, Is there something that you can give me so that I can feed my children? And at this point, the only possessions that St. Francis had were his sandals, his cloak, and a Bible. And at that time, the Bible, of course, was his strength, his comfort, his guidance. It was the one possession that was the most sacred to him and sustained him on his spiritual journey and the journey that he was encouraging other people to take. And yet he saw her desperation and felt inwardly to give to her this Bible. And of course, in that day and age, a Bible was very, very valuable, very rare. And he told her, as he gave it to her, take this Bible, and he told her which shop to go into. It says, and sell it to that shopkeeper, and he will give you a fair price for this Bible. And it will sustain you and your family for a very long time. So he willingly renounced even the sacred Bible that he had held as his only possession, other than the clothes he was standing in. And he felt a moment of sadness, a sense of loss, a little sense of loss at that. And said, Lord, I know that this is your will that I do this, but I feel bereft. I so long to know the gospel of the Lord, and the Bible helped me to understand that. And the Lord responded, Francis, I have written the living gospel in your heart. I have written the living gospel in your heart. And that is an aspect of attunement. To be able to receive God's word so fully that the gospel itself is written on our own hearts. And we learn how to walk and to live and to share the gospel of love and humility of service to others through the great love and devotion that we offer to God and to Guru. And it's a beautiful reminder to devotees, because we don't always have an experience like St. Francis's. And yet we do have experiences. We have a little taste of the divine presence within us at times, and at other times not quite so much. There's a beautiful story that Swami Kriyananda has shared with us. And to me it's particularly touching, because oftentimes with those that we respect and admire on the path, those that are our elder brothers and sisters, if you will, we think that their lives perhaps are a little easier than ours, that they don't struggle as much as we struggle. But Swami Kriyananda tells a story of this practice of attunement. And he shares that the times when he felt the happiest within himself was when he felt the deepest attunement to his Guru. And the times when he struggled and trod with tragedy and trod with just despondency were the times where his attunement was somewhat weakened. He said of it that when he was in that weakened state of attunement, it was as if he was trying to swim in a sea of mud. Swim in a sea of mud. Now, how many of us can say that we've experienced both of those kinds of experiences where the spiritual path seems effortlessly joyful, and other times where we struggle mightily and we cannot remember how to reconnect to the attunement, the depth that we had had before? And of course, the trick, once you realize that you're struggling, is to look within your own heart. Try to recall an experience where you felt the presence of God as deeply as you have experienced it. Don't compare yourself to anyone else. Just experience and recall your own experience and pull upon that and pull it into you. Fill your heart with that experience. Fill your mind, fill your doubts. Bathe yourself in the light of that love, in the light of God, of the grace of the Guru to support and sustain you. And when you do that, eventually, your own attunement will strengthen again. And somehow you will find yourself no longer struggling through the sea of mud, but perhaps soaring joyously high above the clouds, ever closer to the divine presence. It's up to us to offer ourselves and to be able to try our best and also learn acceptance of wherever we happen to be. But nonetheless, do not lose sight of the presence of God within this world that is the source of everything. There's another story of St. Francis that I would like to tell. And in this story, it talks about the process of attunement and of ever deepening understanding of the flow of God's grace in our life. And early on, St. Francis, when he had internally decided that he was going to serve God alone, he often would go to a little crumbled down church. 3 sides of the church had fallen down, only the altar was there, San Damiano, and he prayed in front of a crucifix of Christ. And as he prayed, the crucifix spoke to him, and he felt that he was being asked to rebuild my church. Rebuild my church. And in that moment, St. Francis looked around at the church with 3 sides crumbling down, and he says, I understand, Lord, I can do that for you. In the level of attunement that he had at that moment, it was a very physical transaction that he understood to be true. Rebuild the church. And so he began by taking up the remaining stones that had fallen from the 3 walls and started stacking them stone by stone back up to create the church again. And there weren't enough stones available to rebuild the whole church, so he had to go out into the farmers' fields and dig them up and carry them one by one by one. Again, trying just to rebuild the church. And as the town people started to notice what he was doing, they became very curious. Some of them came and joined him. They physically came and helped him to be able to stack the stones one on top of the other. Others offered support, offering mortar, offering food to sustain those who were doing the physical labor of creating this church. And over time, some of the people who came to help him stayed. And they stayed because they were magnetized by the love and the joy that St. Francis projected in being able to serve his Lord God through the simple process of rebuilding the church. And they stayed, and they completed that church, and they completed 2 others in the general area. And meanwhile, they were also, at least St. Francis was on occasion, wandering and sharing the gospel that was in his heart, and just telling people about the love and joy of God and the simplicity that life can be if we give ourselves into that presence. And eventually, St. Francis came to the understanding that he wasn't merely building 3 physical churches, but that there were going to be thousands of people who were going to be drawn to this expression of love and joy and humility that he was sharing with the world. And so he wrote Rules for a New Order and walked all the way to Rome with a handful of his brothers to meet with the Pope. And as it happened, he came across the Pope just in wandering down the same street in opposite directions, and this little beggar, St. Francis, not particularly attractive to look at, not a member of any specific church functionality or denomination, not a monk, not a theologian, a very simple man of God who simply loved God with all his heart, approached the Pope and tried to explain to the Pope that he wanted his blessing to start a new order. And caught off guard in the middle of the street, the Pope went, "Stay away from me, beggar. Get you gone. I have other things to do." And St. Francis left him and went with his group of brothers and said, "Well, let's continue with what we're doing." And so they continued sharing the gospel as best they could with anyone who would listen, living in incredible poverty, just receiving whatever it is that people offered to them for food or for housing or clothing, etc., and being serviceful to others. And a particular cardinal had observed the interaction between this beggar on the street and the Pope, and he was touched by what it was that St. Francis was offering. And so he invited this little band of brothers to stay with him. And while they stayed with him for a short period of time, he observed them. And what he noticed was that in this little band of brothers, that these individuals were striving mightily to live the gospel, and to share the gospel, and to be ever more perfectly uplifted in God's love and joy. And he thought to himself, or I would imagine the divine offered this thought to him, that these people, this little band of brothers, and the work that they do could be an instrument for God to change the faith across all nations. Across all nations. So he went to the Pope and he asked the Pope, I said, "Please, meet again with this little beggar. What he is asking for, I think, is divinely inspired and will uplift and transform the church and the world. Please, hear him out." So St. Francis had a formal audience with the Pope. And the Pope was struggling with the depth of the intensity that this particular order was offering the world of poverty, of simplicity. It was just so hard to imagine that anybody could possibly live that life. And not only live that life, but live that life in the world. In other words, to interact with worldly people and still try to maintain the presence of God within them that they were striving for. Because at that time, the only form of official Christendom was that monks and nuns would seclude themselves in monasteries, and they would spend their time praying in the cells and living a life secluded from the worldly life. And he just thought this was way too onerous to ask of anyone. And he tried to convince St. Francis to join some of the other established orders. Cannot your little band of brothers join these other groups? And St. Francis said, "No, sir, this needs to be a new order, that we can live joyfully, lovingly in God's embrace." And so the Pope called the group of cardinals together because he wanted more input about this very radical teaching that St. Francis was offering. And the cardinals heard, and the vast majority of them were aghast and outraged at what Francis was proposing. But the one cardinal who had proposed that the Pope listen to St. Francis, he was the one who stood and said, "Please support this effort. The world will be transformed by it." And of course, he was shouted down by the other cardinals, and the Pope concluded the meeting without having reached a decision. And that night, the Pope had a dream. And he dreamed that the church was being shaken and toppled and was starting to fall down. And out of nowhere, this little beggar came running up, and he put his shoulders against the toppling church, and he pushed against the church, and he pushed it back firmly onto its foundation, and he steadied it, and he held it firm. And the Pope recognized that little beggar as St. Francis. And of course, as we know, the Franciscan order has indeed uplifted and transformed the Christian church. And the expression of love and joy and service and humility is a wonderful tradition to help us to open our hearts to God's love. Yogananda used to tell a story about some devotees, and he used the analogy of sleep to help us, encourage us, I think. But he said, different people sleep more heavily than others. And some people, when you try to wake them, you have to literally grab them and shake them and yell in their face, and maybe they'll open one eye and look at you. And while you're shaking and talking to them, they'll sort of be with you. And as soon as you let go, they'll fall back down into sleep again. And yet there are other individuals that, even though they may be deeply asleep, when they hear the barest whispers, and this, of course, is where the analogy comes in, because the whisper is of God's presence in their life, they hear the barest whisper of that presence, and they immediately open both eyes and are awake and ready and alert, and asking inwardly, what is it that you want of me, Lord? How can I be of service to you? How can I love you more deeply? And Yogananda obviously said, be like that devotee. Whether you're a disciple of a guru or not, if you're a truth seeker, seek on the deepest level that you individually understand and go from there. And even at times, if you find yourself swimming in the mud, well, the Guru's job is to help us remember that we are the children of God. Grace flows through the Guru into our lives, helping us to uplift our hearts and to feel more deeply the presence of God within. And we live that presence, and the more we do so, the deeper our attunement becomes. Just like with St. Francis, at first it was just physically build the church. Well, it became a worldwide mission that uplifted many. And Yogananda tells many stories about disciples, and some of whom say, well, they notice differences. And of course, part of a human nature. Well, other people seem to be getting more out of your teachings than I am. Don't you love me as much as you love those? And Yogananda would smile sweetly at them and say, well, I can't come in if you shut me out. These that you say are growing more fully in spirit, that you think are soaring joyfully in God and somehow receiving more in their lives than you are, it's because they allow me to come into every nook and cranny of their consciousness, every aspect of their delusion, of their human delusion caught in darkness. Remember that blazing star of God coming down to the world. Well, that blazing star is available to all of us. We simply need to seek it and do our best to emulate that aspect that draws us ever closer and ever deeper. And if, like when Swami Kriyananda says, he sometimes struggled with his attunement, all right, get back up, back on your own 2 feet, and try and try and try again. Yogananda told a disciple who was afraid that he might lose his spiritual company, he might be alone on the path. He looked deeply into the eyes of this forlorn disciple and said, "Am I not with you always?" And that's an important thing to remember, because God and Guru are with us always. But it's us that sometimes, temporarily, forgets to remember that and shuts God out. Or like a little child whose mother brought him to Yogananda because she wanted him to receive spiritual teachings. And this little boy, Yogananda would try to encourage him or point out something that might be more helpful to him than whatever attitudes and behaviors he was currently expressing. And the little boy would look at Yogananda and he would put out his lip and he would start to cry, "Mommy, he's scolding me, he's scolding me." And he would run away from Yogananda. Now the Guru, to all of us pouting, crying children, is simply trying to send God's light into the deepest, darkest parts of our consciousness, those parts that we don't want to acknowledge to ourselves but are getting in the way of knowing God more fully, of living in God's love and joy more fully. Hand-to-hand combat is how Sister Gyanamata called it. The Guru and the soul of the disciple. Hand-to-hand combat to uplift the disciple. Because it is a struggle. And yet it is indeed our birthright to live in joy and love and divine light. I'm going to close by reading a poem that Yogananda wrote, and it's called God's Boatman. I went to ply my boat many times across the gulf after death, and returned to earth's shores from my home in space. I went to load my boat with all those waiting thirsty ones who have been left behind, that I may carry them to the opalescent pool of iridescent joy, there where my Father distributes his all-desire-quenching liquid peace. Oh, I will come again and again, crossing 1,000,000 crags of suffering. With bleeding feet I will come, if need be 1,000,000,000,000 times, as long as I know that one stray brother is left behind. I want thee, O God, that I may give thee to all. I want salvation, that I may give it to all. Free me then, O Lord, from the bondage of this body, that I may show others how they too can free themselves. I want thine everlasting happiness, but I want also to share it with others, that all of my brothers may find the way to happiness forever and forever in thee. God bless.